the effect, well, the four of you should have dinner at some point. And I'm hoping this panel will be better than that dinner, but of course that depends on what restaurant you are thinking about. I want to get going. I've got many questions, and I know the audience has questions as well. Delighted to see everyone. Welcome, and welcome to those of you watching on YouTube. And I want to begin with a question for all the panelists to address. And I've asked them all to be concise, 2 minutes or so in response. Not easy, but these are big questions too. And then I'll go on to specific questions for each panelist with some follow-ups and then audience Q&A at the end. And just to start, though, each of you had a broad agenda and focused on multiple issues, to serve the needs of your constituents in District 3 and the city at large. You in particular focused on LGBTQ issues for New York residents, to advance the rights of folks through legislation, through advocacy, through education, funding priorities. Would you discuss what your top priority was with respect to LGBTQ issues when you first took office, and be as specific as you can? And let's start in chronological order. We'll start with Tom, then Chris, Corey, and Eric.
Green. I just want to talk about something in my background in addition to being an LGBTQIA plus advocate, and perhaps it's the thing I am most proud of before I was elected, was a landmark New York State court case called Braschi, which said that non-traditional family members were entitled to succeed to rent-regulated apartments. And I don't ever let go of that, please, because it was really, really important. So, one of the first things I did was the city itself had not started to implement it in NYCHA and their city-owned HBD buildings, so that was one of the first things that I had to do. In the very beginning, oh my God. So really early on, the chair of the health committee says they think gay rights cause AIDS. Oh my gosh, and then he took it back, and then he took that back. And then I did what I always did when I was in elementary school and high school. I got mad, and I got fighting mad, and I made a fire speech about how, fill in the word that was, and I think it garnered some respect among my colleagues. I just wanted to, we are in every issue. Our community is every demographic, and so I was particularly passionate about helping poor, low-income New Yorkers, people who really had been left behind, and included in that, there are always queer people. And I will tell one story after being there for a while and getting to know my colleagues. And by the way, everybody's got stuff, right? I have a lot of stuff. I'm willing to share my stuff. The only secrets that I don't tell are the ones I've forgotten myself. But that usually will allow people to tell me things. And I made many, many friends on the city council, but Peter Vallone, who was speaker of the council, was not in favor of the gay rights bill. But he called me to his office pretty early on, and he said to me, you've changed a lot of minds around here. And he gave me a holy card. And it's one of the, it was one of the nicest experiences. It was just the loveliest gesture ever. And one of the things, I did try to start a gay, employees, etc. organization. And a lot of the staff members said they were, A, afraid to come, B, afraid to be seen around me. And it was still in the early 90s, it was, unfortunately, let's not go back there, but we have we need to make a lot of progress in that area. But I think my mere presence, seat at the table, that is the big deal. Just because I was there, that made a big difference. And a nice guy, huh? But don't make me mad. Thank you.
When I got to, there was kind of, before being speaker and then being a council member, let me start with the speaker part and work back. When I was speaker, I really wanted to, and Tom had done a good job getting Peter Malone as speaker to finally fund some LGBT stuff, like the center, which was kind of a work. Peter Malone said you could never fund things that weren't city-owned, which isn't exactly true, it's kind of true. But the center's mortgage was held by the city, so Tom worked that out and got Peter to give money to the center, which was a big deal. But when I was speaker, I really wanted to equalize, to the best degree I could, LGBT plus groups getting city funding, because that had never been a broad goal of the city council. So that was really important. And when I was speaker was when marriage did pass and marriage passed. So we tried to be as helpful to Tom and the then Empire State Project, May Rest in Peace, to their work in Albany by going to Albany and galvanizing the people, etc. So then before I became speaker, Peter, for a little while, Peter Malone was speaker, but then a good friend of mine, Gifford Miller, was speaker. So we wanted to, at that point, find anything in city law, ordinance, or whatever that wasn't LGBT partnership equal, to make it equal. Even if it didn't really make a difference, like if you came here from another state where you could have gotten married, you immediately became a domestic partner. Now, that's not that great of a benefit, but the point was New York City had done everything it could and more. And now it was really in the hands of the state legislature to really bring marriage. So starting in 2002, we really tried to cull through everything to get that done. And then just a bunch more other thing in our efforts around marriage was I worked closely with Kathy Wiles, who's head of the New York City Partnership, which was like the business collective. And we were able to get a letter signed onto by a whole bunch of business CEOs that said basically you have to pay, didn't say we're all Republicans, but that was the thrust, we're all Republicans, to the then Republican Senate, because the Democrats were not the majority as they are now, and so you've put us at a competitive disadvantage to Connecticut and Massachusetts because all of our employees are not getting treated equally. I'll just tell you a funny story. The guy who used to be head of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein. So after the bill passed, I called everyone who signed the letter and said thank you, but it mostly just left messages. So Lloyd Blankfein calls back, which I thought was strange in and of itself, and he says, I don't get it. I'm like, you don't get what, sir? I don't get it. You get married, doesn't take anything out of my pocket. Why do people care? You're not stealing money from me. I don't have to pay you to get married. I don't see the difference. So the world of LGBT rights through the eyes of Lloyd Black.
Thank you for hosting, Stephen. Thank you everyone for being here. I just want to sort of start off and say that I think Eric would probably agree with this. When I became a council member in 2000, I was elected in 2013. Chris was just leaving being speaker. Tom had left being a senator about a year earlier in 2012. And when I got to the council and was a member of the LGBT caucus, which I think was 5 people at that moment, it wasn't really a big deal to be an openly gay elected official. Like, Tom had kind of broken so much ground in the 90s. Chris was his chief of staff and then became council member after him, and then became the first openly gay speaker of the council. That it was kind of like ho-hum, like when I started as an openly gay council member, and that was really because of the work that Chris and Tom had done for many years before I even arrived in New York City. So when I got there, I became chair of the health committee, and I asked to be chair of the health committee specifically when the speaker's race got sorted out, because Chris had previously chaired the health committee before she was speaker, and Tom had chaired the health committee, I believe, was the ranking member or chair in Senate. And I, being an openly HIV positive elected official, the only one in New York City after Tom had left office, I wanted to be able to continue to fight on those issues. And so my first big bill that I passed as a council member 9 months into 2014 was the bill that was mentioned in the introduction, which was allowing transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming New Yorkers to change their birth certificate, which wasn't previously allowed. And when I dug into why it hadn't passed earlier, I found out that the previous Bloomberg administration got kind of scared of the bill at one point and what would happen. And so when I started the process, people internally at the staff of the council were like, are you sure you want to do this? And when we passed it, I think it passed like 42-5. And the day of the hearing that I chaired as health committee chair, not one person showed up in opposition to the bill, which kind of shocked everyone. And so I was really proud to be able to get that done. And then when I became speaker, Chris mentioned it, but it's so important. We were able to, I think, double the amount of money that LGBT organizations got throughout New York City, which was in 2019, our former colleague, Danny Drum, was instrumental as chair of the Finance Committee with me in creating a special initiative, which at the council there are these initiatives that the council controls and funding, and it was specifically said LGBT Community Funding Initiative, and I believe it was like $8 million that got spread out to groups all over the city. And the following year we created a specific trans initiative, which specifically funded trans organizations across New York City, most of whom had never been funded before. So those are some of the sort of highlights of things that I'm most proud of on the LGBT front. But I'll just say that, and I think everyone here would agree, like, I don't know, most of the time, 98% of the time, we were working on things that aren't really LGBT related. We were kind of a seat at the table, as Tom said, and an advocate, but we were dealing with tree pits and school sightings and fights over hospitals closing and, things along that line.
For me, I knew right out of the gate that one of my number one responsibilities was going to be the fight to keep the progress and the funding that we had won from all the people on the stage with me right now. Starting when Tom was in the city council, the city council has discretionary funding, several $100 million of funding in the municipal budget that we get to allocate. And going back to when Tom was in the council, there were LGBT specific and HIV/AIDS specific funding streams that were put into the budget, built on in a big way when Chris became speaker, and then even more when Corey became speaker with Danny Drum as the finance chair. So now with, let's give a round of applause for Danny Drum. So now with a straight cisgender speaker and a straight cisgender finance chair, we are up against the feeling that, a lot of these issues, do we really need all that funding? And the answer is yes. So it's up to us to make the case, and we have been able to do that. In last year's budget, working with my colleagues on the LGBTQIA+ caucus, we were able to maintain the funding that was won from them. But, I actually didn't think that so much of my first year in office would be dominated by LGBTQ issues. But the truth is that they came to our doorstep, right? With the monkeypox outbreak last summer, when our federal government fell down so badly on that issue, we had to really rise to the occasion. With the murders.
You did such a good job on that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Such a good job.
Thank you. Came out of the blue, and we rose to the occasion. The killings and druggings of LGBTQ people in nightclubs, another big issue that we had to rise up and lead on. And then the drag story hour, attacks on drag story hour, and the attacks on our community around the country at this point in time when you'd think with all the progress we've made that we wouldn't be on the defensive like we are, but we are in ways that we haven't been in many years. So that's been dominating in many ways my council term already in ways that I didn't expect.
But when Eric isn't fighting hate crimes and doing all these other things, he's cleaning up the entire district, seemingly single-handedly.
That's a gay issue too.
Exactly. And I'll put my Women in Need hat on. He was the lead sponsor of a piece of legislation that we passed that will require that the city of New York fund mental health professionals in family shelters.
That came from a panel discussion with Chris about a year ago. And I just want to point out the continuum that's here because Chris was Tom's chief of staff. And then I got into politics originally working for Chris. And then I was Corey's chief of staff. Then Corey became council member, I was Corey's chief of staff. Now I'm in the council. And then working with Chris on this bill in this new capacity. It's been really cool.
And I'll tell people a little secret about Eric, which hopefully he won't be upset about, which was Eric initially wanted to run for the city council on the east side of Manhattan.
Well, I remember that.
Because he was living over there. And I had to convince him, because he was doing such a great job as chief of staff and everyone in the community liked him, to move to the West Village in this little tiny apartment. He ended up moving from that apartment. And he was like, nah, I live on the Lower East Side of the East Village. And he kept the continuation going by moving to the West Side.
I need to just jump in. First of all, I got a couple $1,000s for Dyke TV. It was a bigger story than the Duchess of Sussex. It was Dyke TV. Anyway, the other thing is, because of Rudy Giuliani, he tried to eliminate what was then called the Division of Aid Services, and it was only building upon the outrage over that by rank and file New Yorkers and all of my colleagues was I able to get that bill enshrined in law, and it really is a model for how social services should be provided, but it works well. And domestic partnership, this is another Rudy Giuliani, the bill I had said, wherever it said marriage, they just were supposed to insert domestic partnership. But no, Rudy Giuliani had to have his people go through everything, the administrative code. And so anytime a new bill was passed, or a new the law had to be changed. But the thing is, for both of those things, I believe they were both, I'm sure they were both unanimous votes, so he couldn't veto them. And thank you, Rudy, for trying to destroy us because we beat you back.
Thank you for these opening comments. And you four know each other? And, well, yeah. Now, I think the real pivotal moment in New York political history in this context is around 1990, right? Following the dissolution of the Board of Estimate in 1989, the enactment of the city charter in 1988, city council is transformed. It's the city council we know today really goes back to that time period when Tom was first elected in 91 in terms of land use decisions and budgetary matters, always been local laws. But and the size of city council increased from 35 to 51 at that time as well. And part of the city charter in the late 80s was to increase minority representation. And in the 91 elections, when Tom was elected, the number of African Americans elected had increased from 6 to 12, Latinos from 3 to 9. So I think seeing this as a real turning point circa 1990-91, and I want to go back to Tom, your election, because it was...
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because it wasn't so much that the charter said that there had to be a gay livable district or there had to be diversity. It was that the federal Department of Justice said that the New York City Council's, that the city of New York's government was in violation of the Civil Rights Act. Because in the Board of Estimate, each borough got one vote. So Brooklyn, which has a ton of people, had the same power as Staten Island, which doesn't have a ton of people. So it violated the one person, one vote provision, and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice said you have to diversify. You have to diversify in blah, blah, specific community, and then other, which was determined to be LGBT, and I think Asian at that point was in the other, as opposed to maybe not. And I only know this about civil rights, we remain covered and kind of under the jurisdiction of the civil rights, because when we had to redistrict, when I was speaker, we had to send it to the Department of Justice to get an okay or not okay, and you send them a draft, they didn't love our draft. We came back and fixed it, and I think that process still remains. Yeah, pre-clearance, that's right.
Yeah. Thank you for that political history, Chris. And it's also worth noting, talking about political history, that Tom wasn't the first openly gay person to run. In 1973, Jim Howells ran against Carol Greitzer in the district encompassing Greenwich Village. Lost, I think he got about 17% of the vote. The Gay Activists Alliance. 1985, David Rothenberg also ran against Carol Greitzer, lost. And Tom, you yourself lost the
Almost
first.
won though.
Almost. Tom ran in '89 and lost to Greitzer too.
It's a special club, the run and then do it again club.
Yeah. But in '91, again, a real turning point, Tom, and in particular, Tom announced that he was HIV positive on the eve of the '91 election, and it was a real...
He did the very first thing I said.
Second.
That was the first feeling, I think.
Oh, it was the first.
The very first, I mailed out, I sent a letter to all of the voters in the district telling them that I wanted them to know that I was living with HIV so they could factor that in as they decided who to vote for. And I represented amazing, wonderful people. So,
Could you tell us about that decision?
so I've been HIV positive since, I believe, 1983, definitely 1985. But the person never asked the right question. They said, when did you find out? I got my test results in 1988, at the very end of 1988, and I had already started running for the council. I had told practically no one, and I wasn't really, that's how it is, that's how it was with HIV. I wasn't surprised, I knew my sexual history, but 40 years of condom use. Anyway, after that loss, I decided I was going to do it again, I was going to run again, and I was going to run being open about my HIV status. And so I, in a way, set in motion making it so it would be impossible for me not to. I joined the HIV positive caucus of ACT UP. I did many things to show that I was working with and living with and advocating alongside people who were avowedly HIV positive, because I wanted to make a foundation. And I think I said before, I couldn't not tell people. And so many people that I loved, not just queer people, non-queer people, been lost. I had no choice. I don't know how else to say it. I had no choice but to do it. But I did it by sending out a letter. And it was because a city council member in Minneapolis, Brian Coyle, a wonderful community activist, came out as being HIV positive. He actually had AIDS while he was on the Minneapolis City Council. And I called him up and I asked him how he did it. And he said, well, I had the press follow me around a date, and they thought it was a day in the life of a council member, and they were about to end the embargo and announce it. And he said, I have to tell people in my district personally. I don't want them to hear it the same way everyone else. And I wrote them a letter. So it was really his example that said, yes, that's a good way to do it. It was specifically for the people in the district that I was running in. I wanted them to know that about me.
And in fact, it galvanized AIDS activists citywide, in your district in particular, healthcare activists. And it's a good segue to Corey. You first ran in 2013, as you said, but in October of 2004, you found out at the age of 22 you were HIV positive after you visited your doctor for a physical exam, told you the news was devastating. First, you didn't tell anybody, including your own mother, who you spoke to every day, and you're very open and candid with her. Fast forward to 2013, you decided to run to succeed Chris in District 3. You called up Tom and talked about this issue. Would you tell us about that phone call?
Well, I called up Tom months and months earlier asking for his endorsement because Tom's endorsement was really, really important in the district. And Tom agreed to endorse me, and we were rolling out endorsements. Jerry Nadler had endorsed me, we rolled it out. Dick Gottfried had endorsed me, we rolled it out. We were rolling out local endorsements, and we were about to roll out Tom's endorsement. It was April of 2013. And the press release was ready to go out, and we had a piece of mail that we were about to send out to voters across the district with Tom's picture on it. And Tom called me up the night before the mail piece was going to go out and said, I have a question for you. And I said, yes. And Tom knew I was HIV positive. And he said, I have a question for you. And I said, yes. He said, do the voters know they're HIV positive? And I said, no. And he said, why not? And I said, I don't know, my friends know, but I've never made a declaration. He says, why? And I said, because I haven't told my mother. And he said, I can't endorse you until you publicly say you're HIV positive. And I said, really? I said, I'm in the middle of the campaign.
I said, you haven't told your mother yet, have you? Next weekend, you got us.
No, so I 3 days later, I drove back to Salem, Massachusetts, and took my mother down to the Salem Willows, which is on the water. My mother lives in Salem, and I told her that I was HIV positive, and she was sort of heartbroken and devastated that for, at that point, 9 years I had been living with HIV, and I never told her. She felt terrible about it. She was amazing and wonderful and great. And then a week after that, Genia Belafonte, who writes a weekly column for the New York Times called what's it called, My City column or Big City column? Big City. She wrote a story about Tom talking about it in 1991, and then 22 years later, me talking about it. And so it really came about because Tom had rightfully said, you need to be open about this. We can't go backwards. I announced it 22 years ago, and your friends know, and I know, and other people know. It's time to talk about it publicly. So that's the story.
But I want to say that my parents were among the very last people that I told. And it's incredibly hard. In retrospect, I now realize, of course they would want to know because they were worrying anyway. I was gay, openly gay, so it wasn't completely unexpected, but it was the hardest. It was the hardest of all was to tell my parents. And it almost became urgent because I was going to tell the world, and I had to let them know in advance, you know? But it was quite a...
Thank you both of you. Thank you both of you. And it had an empowering effect, without question. I want to transition to Chris. In 1998, Tom decided to vacate his city council seat and run for state senate. And as Ali said in the introduction, you had served as his chief of staff for 5 years. But you were also executive director of the New York Gay and Lesbian Anti-Violence Project, and you were a member of the Gay and Lesbian Independent Democrats. We could do a whole panel about your work, all of your work, before you were elected, at the community level, at the grassroots level, which I think is particularly fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about local activism and your role and your involvement in the Gay and Lesbian Independent Democrats and what that club meant in general and for you in particular?
Sure. There's a ton of history there that Tom can talk about, but I'm going to leap over as it relates to some infighting in the community. Shockingly, there would be infighting in the LGBT community. But, I've often said that if it wasn't for the center, I would never have been a council member or speaker. And what do I mean by that? The center, I don't know if they still do, but they used to have these lockers here. So GLID had a locker. We put, the pamphlets and the folding table and all that stuff in the locker. And out of that locker, this political club, had a huge force and huge presence on politics in the borough of Manhattan. And, it's so interesting because back in like the 90s, there was a question on the questionnaire, which was, will you write GLID's name out in full on your literature? And in the last, one of the presidential debates, I forget, maybe it was Castro mixed up trans man and trans woman when talking about gynecological issues, and the community got all over him. I thought, geez, it's not that long ago before we were begging for folks to put the full words there. But GLID held Manhattan accountable. And in most of the districts in Manhattan, not to have a GLID endorsement was an enormous problem, because the assumption was that you were not good on gay issues if you didn't get the endorsement. And it was really critical. And judges and borough presidents and mayors would really come, begging for it. Occasionally you sign people up to make sure you have votes in a Democratic club. I don't know, occasionally. Some people do that, I don't know. It still gets done. So my late father was a member of GLID, except he used to call it the Gaelic League of Independent Democrats. But it was a force, and it showed in the same way Danny Drum's history and his community showed that you have to organize to get attention, and if there isn't attention, there'll never be change. And it's interesting, when I started at WIN, 70% of the people in shelter tonight are families with children. Nobody knows that, because all they see in the paper about homeless people is frightening pictures of homeless men, and it's designed, by the New York Post and others to separate us. So the first thing I did was start a campaign called The Forgotten Face of Homelessness. Because if you don't know there's an issue, you can't hold elected officials accountable. And that's what GLID did, as well as organize the community to flex its muscles, so when LGBT people ran, they felt an obligation to go out there and be supportive of them. And it also created a situation like, well, if you're not going to support Tom, why should the club support you? Or if you're not going to support Eric, why, et cetera, et cetera. And that's powerful too. It's real old school politics, which is still how it's done.
It's really fascinating. Tom was member before he was district leader, elected in '82 of the Chelsea Gay Association. Corey was on the community board for many years before he was elected. Eric, speaking of local affairs, in Chelsea this past December, and you alluded to this earlier, you attended a drag story hour at a public library. It was targeted by about 20 anti-trans protesters from far-right organizations. 2 protesters actually were arrested for entering your building and refusing to leave it initially. They ultimately did. And your sidewalk was defaced. They called you homophobic slurs. District 25 in Queens, Shekhar Krishnan was also the victim of harassment in a similar context. Could you tell us, how did you respond to this hate, and why, in your view, is Drag Story Hour an important public program?
Well, what I did right away was, starting with the day I went to a drag story hour at the library in Chelsea, and I didn't expect to see what I saw when I got there. I thought I was going to go to drag story hour, and when I turned the corner, I knew that we were going to have a different kind of experience than I was anticipating, because there were dozens of this vile people with the most disgusting signs, and I filmed them and put it right online. Said, I want people to see what's happening in Chelsea. We hear about what's happening in Kansas and Florida and Texas. Look what's happening right in Chelsea. And that went viral. And on Monday, they came to our office, and basically like 10 of these people came to our office, and like we were barricaded in the office for like an hour while they were like pounding on the door, like, let us in, groomer, child molester, and when they left, they vandalized the hallway. And that night I went to CBST for a menorah lighting and turned my phone off for the menorah lighting, and afterwards when I turned it on I saw missed calls from my neighbors in my apartment building and my super, and I immediately knew that meant that they had come to that they were at my home. When I turned the corner when I got there, and the place was lit up like there was like two different cordoned off areas of police tape and like 10 police cars. My neighbors probably thought there was like a triple homicide in the building, but the whole sidewalk was covered, like rumor or pedophile. And 2 of them were arrested for going in the building. A third one was arrested for assaulting one of my neighbors who tried to intervene. And I posted that online. That was my response immediately, was to show the world what they had done. And they really hated that. They really hated that the negative press that they got. And the interesting thing is that they had been doing this in New York for some time, and like a couple of years, and they had been to my colleague's house in Queens, Shaker Christian. But I think that there's something about the district we represent, like in Manhattan, in the middle of Manhattan, that, you know, you have like the spotlight of the world on where we are, and I think it's unfortunate, but I think that things that are just, they get more attention when they happen here, as opposed to like out in Queens or in Staten Island. And I think drag story hour, to answer your question, why is it important? It's important because it's a quality program that teaches love of reading and also lessons about diversity and how we're all made of different shapes and sizes. But I think it's become important now because it's just being used as another vessel to rehash these evil tropes about our community that have been used for thousands of years, that we're predators against children. It's just the latest thing that people are using to attack us.
And I just want to say, what Eric just talked about is just an example. There are unfortunately others of why people who say we're post-gay when it comes to life or electoral politics are just wrong. It just flat out wrong.
Tom, would you discuss your reception in City Council when you first took office in 1992? And I'm asking this sort of building off of what Eric just talked about, this notion of New York City as a gay-friendly city. And I asked this question, as Ali was mentioning, I'm doing a project on the 1986 Gay Rights Bill. And even when that bill was passed in 86, the vote was 21 to 14. So 14 council members were opposed to it as late as 1986. And, as I understand it, you had to, there were battles with different caucuses in council about funding AIDS initiatives, even among liberals. So it's an interesting development, the expansion of the liberal coalition and how that wasn't as seamless as one might assume. Could you talk about that, your reception in City Council among your colleagues?
I think many of them were almost like they'd never met a gay person before who was out. And so I was a little bit of a curiosity to them. And I was sort of treated that way. I mean, in a way, I had to be the one to make the overtures to people, and nothing compared to the Senate years later, where someone wouldn't even shake my hand. But anyway, I just got to really know what was important to them, and I listened to them, and hope that they listened to what I had to say, and a lot of coalition building. I did a tremendous amount of coalition building, particularly with people of color, but also there were more women on the council, which was better. than there had been when the council went from 35 to 51. I found women to understand the concept, and people of color to understand the concept of you have to not only be very good, you have to be like 80,000 times better than other people in order to even get there. So just the solidarity meant something. And, I guess, I don't know, maybe some of you don't know either. I mean, I'm a nice guy, and I was friendly, and I encouraged people to talk to me. And the number of people who then would say my nephew, or I've always thought that, my uncle. And there was one council member who I knew that there had been a closeted African-American council member, and one of my colleagues who was not pro-LGBTQIA, but who changed over time, said to me, I said, oh yeah, I knew that. I mean, but it just, just bringing it out into the open was a big deal. And I don't know, I'm a kid from Queens, you know what I mean? And, which is a huge advantage in the world, sorry. I mean, you're not Queens, but you sound like it, you know what I'm saying? And I'm just a regular guy most of the time, unless you make me mad. And they saw that, and the people in their family and their friends, and they live next door to people. Oh my God, one of the people who said they were going to vote for marriage in the Senate, the two lesbians who lived next door, he had told, even then he was going to vote yes, like he told me, and he voted no. Can you imagine that? I mean, so people, sometimes, sometimes people are very surprising, the people that turn around and like get it and want to stand, side by side with you. And then sometimes there are people like, I can't believe that. But I would always focus on the people that it was like a pleasant surprise that all of us, that they had opened up their minds, and the people who were unable to do it, I was nice to them, but what are you gonna do? And I think that's, but both of those bills did pass unanimously, which was pretty amazing.
Well, coalition building, as you say, was critical. And interestingly enough, somebody mentioned Antonio Pagan, who was also openly gay, elected in 1991.
Yes, but I was the gay one. He was
yeah,
I was the gay one.
He doesn't count.
No, he does.
He avoided discussion.
But no, I mean, I was the gay one. It was funny. He was the anti-crime Latinx person from the Lower East Side and gay. And I was the gay one, so I took, those issues just came to me. I inherited, I attracted those issues, and he wasn't that excited by them. He wasn't, well, there we go. So it's all going to be in the book that I'm going to write, and I'm going to put sex in, so you're all going to read it too.
And then Phil Reed and Margarita Lopez were both elected in 1997.
And then I fled.
Yes.
I mean, Phil was, I think, not that Margarita wasn't, but I think Phil was a particularly big deal because Phil, may he rest in peace, was an African-American gay man. The district he represented was actually more Latinx than it was African-American. And at the point he got elected in 97, there was still a lot of maybe not expressed, or maybe expressed homophobia and AIDS phobia. He was HIV positive in the African-American and Latinx community. So I really thought his victory sent a message that we could get elected anywhere if we worked hard, had good community roots, which he did, etc. And I think his victory and Margarita's victory were helpful in moving the folks in Queens and other places forward to run for office, because it showed that it wasn't just that the quote-unquote gay winnable district where people could win.
Sure, and it also diversified the council as well. Corey.
I said to Danny, because he had run the most wonderful gay pride parade in all of the city for years and had done many other things in the community. And one day outside a Unitarian church, thank heavens for Unitarian church in Queens, I said, Danny, you should run for office today. I said, but you're doing the work anyway. And I encouraged him to run. And he was blocked a little by the organization in the beginning, and then he was just like, bleep that, and ran against the organization and won because he was a terrific guy and a great community activist and a former teacher in the district where the Children of the Rainbow issue was Mary Cummings.
24.
Mary Cummings.
We had a panel on that last year at New York Historical Society, and we also did an online
And Curtis
exhibit
Lee
on the
was on the
children.
wrong side of that issue.
Yeah,
just
this is the 1992 Children of the Rainbow curriculum controversy. And some of the comments that Eric had to endure were really prominent back in 1992. So we see this continuity, issues are being distorted. The curriculum, in short, there was a unit on the family. This is for first grade public teachers to teach about different kinds of family structures, including same-sex headed households. But that was really, became really distorted and vitriolic, and Danny Trump came out publicly as a gay teacher in fourth grade in Sunnyside, ultimately started the Queen's Pride Parade. So, yeah, and we're seeing that the expansion of the geography started here in District 3 into Queens and ultimately Brooklyn, Staten Island, and the Bronx. And I want to turn to Corey. Corey, your second term, you served as Speaker of the City Council. And the Speaker of the City Council is elected by City Council members. You lead them in setting priorities, passing laws, directing public money for the benefit of New Yorkers. And you were alluding to this earlier, but would you just talk about like different kinds of LGBTQ organizations and services that you prioritized as Speaker? Because it's truly remarkable, like the expansion of funding that has occurred from the early 90s to the present. Could you give us some insight on that?
Sure. Before you do that, I just want to say one thing that was really, really important for my run for Speaker, which was when Chris ran for Speaker in 2005 and was elected in January of 2006, she had used this model, which she, I think, was one of the people who kind of managed Gifford Miller's campaign for Speaker in 2001, and she had used this model of kind of going around the city, helping people in their campaigns, raising them money, door knocking with them, and sort of getting to know people in their districts in every single part of the city. And I used sort of the model that Chris had used, 8 years earlier, 12 years earlier, for my own run for Speaker, and it was very, very effective when I would be in Southeast Queens in a predominantly African American area, and I would get to know the council member and the leaders in their district. And Chris had done that, and she could probably tell the story, but one of the key moments for Chris was getting the support of then County Leader Tom Manton, an old Irishman who was a more conservative to moderate Democrat. When it was a big, big deal for him to support Chris for Speaker and was a key moment. And for me, when Joe Crowley, who was sort of a mentee of Tom Manton, former congressman, decided to support me, he said to me, we were really proud when Tom decided to support Chris. And we're really proud to be able to support you. We're proud that that's what the Queens Democratic Organization stands for. And I was only able to do that because of kind of the work that Chris had done, 12 years earlier. Her run, let me get to your question. I mean, one of the things that people don't realize is that, as Eric talked about, the discretionary money that the council gives out, individual council members get to give out about $400,000 in discretionary money to organizations in their district every year, and you're typically giving out like $7,000 or $10,000 to a local group. But the council as a whole, and the process is controlled by the Speaker, I believe as it should be, that there's a pot of about $400 million in initiative money. At least the pot grew that much to that when I became Speaker. And you're able to give out, we gave out to the Hedrick Martins to $1 million a year to fund a program for them. We gave out to Sage $1 million a year to be able to open up a senior center in every borough. We were giving out, $300,000 to Destination Tomorrow, a trans organization in the Bronx. I mean, these are things that kind of the press doesn't write about, that most local constituents don't know about, but really provide services. And so we were funding, Chris started this, and then I expanded on it, but we were funding organizations in districts where if they didn't have the city money, they probably wouldn't exist. They literally wouldn't be in business, wouldn't be providing services in Fort Greene or in the South Bronx or in Central Queens. And so one of the things that we all talked about at the beginning of this panel was sort of how proud we were to do that and continue that funding when most people don't write about this or know about it. It doesn't grab headlines, but it's deeply, deeply important for HIV and AIDS, for women's health, for LGBT people. And the final thing I'll say, which I think is a key moment that was a big deal at the time, and again, each one of us built on it, but when Chris was speaker, and she could talk about this, when Chris was speaker, it was during the Great Recession, and the city budget shrank quite a bit, and then Mayor Bloomberg tried to take away a lot of money for runaway and homeless youth funding for LGBT young people. And Chris and the late Lou Fidler, a former councilman, were able to stop that kind of defunding of beds for runaway and homeless youth, which was a really, really, really big deal at the time. And that fight, I think, sort of set the stage for those of us who came afterwards to say, if they try to come after our money, we know we can defeat them.
Thank you. Thank you. Two more quick questions, and then a question for all four panelists. Chris, as speaker, you played an important role in the passage of same-sex marriage legislation in 2011. Would you, and each of the panelists actually were involved, worked in some capacity to pass the bill. Tom introduced it in the state Senate. Would you talk about your trips to Albany and your efforts to convince reluctant state assembly members and senators to come on board?
Well, the first round, as Tom kind of alluded to, when it didn't win, there were there was enough senators who had lied to people's faces, had not just lied to Tom and me, which, you could lie to me and Tom, that's fine.
In politics, like your words.
It is everything. But they lied like our questionnaires of the Empire State Project, where they had actually written, yes, I'll vote for it. So that after that, there were lots of meetings in the districts, trips up to Albany, and I'm not gonna remember all the senators' names, so Tom's gonna have to help me. The guy who always wore cowboy boots and had his dog in the office, a little bit younger. No, he's another one. No, anyway, this guy, he was like, signature was he wore cowboy boots, and he always had his dog in the office, which I like, but, folks, and we were meeting with him over and over, and I remember he came to New York, and we had coffee, my chief of staff and I, with him, at this restaurant near City Hall, and he was like, can you get me Sarah Palin? Palin, what do you have in mind? Like, I had met with this guy, and every time,
he came when I was later on. He upstate that he had an Irish name.
Yeah.
He
may have been indicted, I don't know.
No, he was one of the ones that did not go to jail.
Oh, okay. So that was weird, because I met with him numerous times, and he clearly hadn't gotten the drift. We never got his vote, but whatever. Then there was this guy, yeah, something like that. Gallagher. Gallivant. You're right. Gallivant. Then there was Alisi, who thought he was the most important because his name started with A, and he was going to be the first vote.
Who had said, I didn't even ask him. He came up to me and he said, I'm voting for your bill. Because out of respect, I think everyone's office.
Alisi.
Who was a bachelor. Just saying.
Committed bachelor.
Although his literature always showed him with a woman and children in the background, which is interesting.
So, and he was, and partly I'm giving these details because this is how politics really works. It's like knowing these things. He was extremely high maintenance. You had to pay him a ton of attention. Like we had to get Bloomberg to call him personally. Bloomberg wanted to call a Republican state senator as much as you want to eat glass. You know what I mean? But we had to do it, he needed a lot of attention. Then there was this guy, Senator Martin, who was from like the Mineola section of Long Island, and I grew up in Glen Cove, so it was kind of like the same thing. And
Back in the Senate, he just won again.
just won, right? He voted no, right?
Yes.
I did not like him, and that meeting did not go. And I stormed out.
What happened with Andy Lanza? What was he supposed to vote for?
Andrew Landsman,
Lanza.
nice fellow, who he put this in the paper.
Stop.
On her deathbed,
Staten
Staten Island Republican, on her deathbed, asked him to vote for marriage equality. As she was taking her last breath, that was one of her last requests. And he was, of course, in favor, but he was afraid to vote yes because of the Conservative Party. He was, lesbian sister, right? And everybody's got one these days. I mean, they're supposed to be support group if you don't have it. But he is also the one that told me, but the bill was never supposed to be voted on 2009, by the way, but he's the one that told me that the Republicans had decided as a conference to all vote no. Why? Because money is poison, and they wanted to get another 2 years of rich people giving to Republicans who might vote for same-sex marriage. So I kept saying, a vote of conscience? No, it was a vote of conference. They all decided to vote. At least he told me, and I knew it was over.
So that's Lanza. And then there was Flanagan from Nassau County, who I schlepped out to.
I was in the car.
That's right, there we go.
Like I'm in the parking lot. It was like a mini mall.
Yeah, it was very bizarre. And we went through all of the motions with him, and then he ended up voting them. Now, I tell you all these little vignettes because even though they voted no, they required no's. They didn't make a big drama necessarily, which was a good thing. And some of them, yes, it's like, let's see. But I tell you that story is really because when you're lobbying people for LGBTQ issues or HIV/AIDS issues or whatever issues, you have to know who you're lobbying, right? And what their thing is, what their hobby is, where they went to college, all of that stuff, so you can engage in conversations. And these little oddities about them, like the woman and the kids in the background, are, very, very relevant and can make you more successful, however you define success with the person that you're talking about. Who was the lovely African-American woman from Westchester? No. Who's not in the Senate anymore, who voted no the first time.
Oh, sure. Oh, but see, that was Shirley Huntley from the Senate.
No, that was Queen. She's Queen.
Ruth Haskell.
Ruth Haskell Johnson.
We were always going to get her. She had a...
But I think she voted no the first time.
No, she voted yes and made a nice speech.
Okay. So I went to see her and she was having...
But she wouldn't say. But I knew.
She was having a canned food drive for something or another. Well, you've never seen so many cans organized by Eric Gotcher and sent to Ruth Haskell Thompson's office. That mattered. We wanted to lock her in and get her on the record early. So, again, it's all politics is local.
Yeah, thank you. And
You know my Shirley story, right?
you've told me, yeah. And Chris, as you've commented before, it's so powerful to look someone in the eye and say, you tell me that I don't have the right to marry someone I love. And you've commented that before. I found that to be really emotional and powerful.
It's true, and because it's really easy to hate somebody you don't know. And it's really easy to do something shitty to somebody you're not standing next to, right?
I'm treating you equally, and you have to say, well, in fact, you're not. You can't say that. You're not treating us.
And Barney Franks has a version of that and I forget his exact phrasing. I mean, I've said, like, look me in the eye and tell me that my family's less equal than your family. But Barney has something like that he says that his mother's taught him, which I always find very powerful when he says that his mother is taught him, who's now running a bed and breakfast in Maine.
I want to be mindful of time. I know Eric has another appointment. Corey does too. Eric, you're running for re-election as we speak. You were just endorsed by the Jim Owls Liberal Democratic Club. Congratulations. And you had to fill out a questionnaire. And if you want to know his stance on, 30 questions or so, 40 questions almost. You can read them online. I was interested, there's a question about the decriminalization of sex work. And you said you were in favor of the decriminalization of sex work. Would you tell us why? Discuss this.
I just said that two consenting adults in a victimless exchange should be able to do that. I mean, that's just my position.
Unless someone's getting hurt, unless someone is getting hurt, if your bodies stay away. And it is the purest form of capitalism, if you think about it.
I would just add, I think, that, there are concerns, I agree with Eric's position, 100%. But there are concerns that are valid about whether this will reduce some of the tools to fight sex trafficking. I don't think it will, but the best thing that could happen is to do that bill coupled with some legislation that would beef up the penalties around sex trafficking and a funding initiative for those who have been trafficked, because we're seeing at WIN with the folks who have come here as asylum seekers, many of them are traffic victims. But I think if you did that together, then it really makes the point that Eric just made about consenting adults. And I think it can only be done by Albany, right? The criminal code.
Very complicated,
Yeah.
and I don't know that they've gotten it exactly right anywhere in the world, but
But you're 100 positions on it, right?
Even like Amnesty International and one of the other human rights groups, they disagree on whether legalization or decriminalization is the way to go. So, I mean, I'm on the live and let live team. Unless you do something bad to someone, in which case there are laws that should take care of,
Right.
it's all about trying to control women's bodies. And that is, I'm gonna use a bad word, blackjack.
Thank you. I have a concluding question for all four panelists, and I'm going in reverse chronological order this time, from Eric to Corey to Chris and Tom. I want to commend all four of you for speaking openly in different public forums about personal struggles with addiction, or in the case of you, Eric, suicidal ideas and even attempted suicide. And you spoke very openly and candidly in our own exhibit, A Seat at the Table. Again, I appreciate that, and thank you for your participation. And that and in other forums too. And would you all just talk a little bit about how, having gone through these immense struggles and challenges, have made you more empathetic, aware, and compassionate as elected officials? Eric?
I've thought about this, and I sometimes think if I wasn't born as a gay person in a rural area, if I wasn't a survivor of suicide attempts, if I would be in the role that I'm in. And I actually don't think I would be. I think, maybe I'd be like running my dad's fly fishing shop with like 2 kids in the Adirondacks, right? But I think that going through these experiences is what drew me into a life of wanting to make a big difference while I'm on this planet, and feeling the urgency. I've always felt an urgency to do a lot while I'm here, and maybe it is being a survivor of suicide. I've always felt that, life is gonna go by very quickly, and what am I gonna do while I'm here? And so I picked what I think is one of the best paths to make the biggest impact while we're here, because life goes by like that. I mean, it really does if you think about it. And that no one ever says at a memorial service, he took the best vacations, or he had the best cars and the best clothes. No, this is what he did. These are the people he touched. These are the people he helped.
I would just say, I came out when I was 16 years old in a small town in Massachusetts. I was the only openly gay student in my school when I came out. It was 6 months after Matthew Shepard had been murdered in Wyoming. Chris was just like the council at that time. I had never been in New York City. Tom was in the state senate at the time. I didn't know who they were. Eric was, I think, just starting at George Washington University, and I came out in this little tiny town, and people say, you know, like, why did you come out? You know, I was a junior in high school and I was captain of the football team, and I came out because I was suicidal, and I felt like if I didn't come out, I couldn't live. Like, I needed to talk about it. And that kind of moment sort of became, in some ways, like a template for my life, where, you know, I came out about the fact that I got sober in 2009. And when I decided to not run for mayor in 2021, because I was dealing with depression at the time, during being locked down during COVID and running the council remotely and dealing with the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and a $9 billion budget deficit and all the pressure that came with that. When I decided not to run, people said to me, you know, just say you're not running. And I said, no, I'm going to say I'm not running because I'm dealing with depression. And they said, why? What are you going to get from that? And I said, it's what I've always done. Like, I don't want to live my life with shame. I don't want to, you know, act in a shameful way about who I am or what my feelings are or what I'm struggling with. And the person who taught me that was my mother. My mother was the person who taught me to always be honest, to not have shame about who you are, what you're going through. And she would always say something to me, which is something that I heard in sobriety as well, is you're only as sick as your secrets. And if you don't want to be sick, you don't have to have a lot of secrets. So that's what became a template for my life.
So I grew up in a very Irish Catholic household in the 70s and 80s, and you know, where some words were only ever whispered, like, you know, she has cancer, they're getting a divorce, he's an alcoholic. Like, you never said those in actual volume, right? And you can tell from my volume, my house was not particularly quiet, it was loud people, but those things only got whispered. And my mother, who died of breast cancer when I was 16, they never told me she had cancer. I found out inadvertently because my mother and father had told the school I went to, and one of the nuns said to one of the girls I was friends with, make sure you're extra nice to Christine as they called me, because her mother has cancer, which my friend told me, and I was like, that's not true. And then I still didn't ask my mother, I asked my sister, and she was like, yeah, so anyway, I say all that to say, you know, I don't come to adulthood with a well-oiled muscle as it relates to disclosing things, sharing things. So almost exactly a year ago, when I got diagnosed with colon cancer, my, you know, first reaction was, so I got diagnosed in May, and my surgery was over Memorial Day weekend. So in my mind, I was like, this is great. 3-day weekend. Nobody has to know. You know what I mean? And then if I'm like a little laid up for a couple of days, I can just Zoom whatever, you know, say I'm down the shore. And that was my first reaction, because that's kind of what was modeled for me. Do you know what I mean? And then I realized that I wanted to disclose that I had cancer for a couple of reasons. One, kind of like Corey said, I just needed to. Not so much because I thought it would really help people or not help people, that kind of came later, I just needed to. Two, I'm 56, I'll be 57 in July. My mother died when she was 56. And I knew that that the year of 56 would be hard. I had heard from other people that was particularly hard, but I didn't expect to have cancer when I was 56, which really threw shit, you know what I'm saying, off the rails. So I needed to. And I was glad I did, because people who, sometimes, maybe not everybody, but some people I think would relate to this, you put people in a box. They're like your government friend, your political friend, your real friend, your da-da-da. And And I had people who weren't in the real friend or go to the movies with friend box who like reached out, and one of them said, I want to suffocate you with love, which is an interesting way to say it, but and so it made a huge difference to me and was incredibly helpful, and I think, or I hope, helpful to other people who have cancer or had cancer as well. I will say, since I brought up the topic, that on next Friday, I have so it's basically a year to date of surgery. Next Friday, I have a PET scan, and then the day after Memorial Day, I have a colonoscopy, and then the first week of June, I meet with the doctor. I don't know if I'll get the results before or after, and if that is all clear, or as they say now, they don't say remission, they say NED. If you're NED, no evidence of disease, a year is like a huge marker for colon cancer. So watch, I will disclose it either way.
I'm a survivor, childhood survivor, which I didn't realize till recovered memory much later on. I am a person in recovery from drugs and alcohol for 40 years, and but with the help of others, that was the only way I could do it. Say more, if something doesn't come up, it's hard for me to announce it, but I'm also a recovering love and sex addict for 23 years. And I have problems with other stuff, like money and love, like, romantic sessions and everything but gambling. So, gotta be, not this.
For the casino license.
Well, I went to the track once, and I was doing very well, and then I didn't want to leave, and I said, I must never come here again. And I have had also a mental health consumer for depression, and I also believe that I used work as a drug to ease my depression. So it was a coping mechanism. And I also, as a long-term survivor, and it's not uncommon, I have had abnormal anal cells, precancerous cells, sliced out. It's incredibly difficult to get an anal pap smear, which I'm sure you've all come up with people constituents asking. Anyway, but it doesn't always come up, so since you asked, I thought, all right, you're supposed to laugh at that. Since you asked, anyway, tell people, long-term survivors of HIV, get an anal pap smear. Very important. And I have to, I don't know how not to tell the truth anymore, or for a long, long time. And the other thing which I haven't, so the breaking news here, I'm also an adult survivor. Something terrible happened to me in Albany, and I'm going to use the window that's open now to go to court over it. And I was in my 40s, and I did exactly what victims to survivors do. I froze. But I did tell someone immediately afterwards, and then I told someone in group therapy, I told people in group therapy, I told a few other people, and then I talked about it at an anti-violence project fundraiser. I was going to talk about a tired old story when I'd been beaten up at the parking lot of a gay bar, but that's so many years ago. I told that story, and I said, wait a minute, I want to tell a different story, because I think it's really crucial that people who are adult survivors are able to get redress, not for the money or this, but just perpetrators tend to progress, and I do have a regret that I didn't go back immediately and confront this person. Now it's, years later, and who knows how many other people, I don't find any evidence of it, but I know for sure that I am not the only one. So, you heard it here first.
It's
to put the case to conclude, the panelists did ask me to end at 7:30, and would you please give them a round of applause?
We'll be here for a little while.